demo.
Okay. Countdown 5. All right, we are at the top of the hour. We'll give everybody just a minute or two to trickle in. Awesome, got 5 or 6 people so far. Hey everybody, thanks for joining. We'll give us just a second for everyone to trickle in. There we go. Jumped up to 100 plus. I love that. What a good audience. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, Ellie, is that showing up for you?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. This is going to be the journey to 10x revenue insights from Canvas GFX for solutions hire, Ellie Linehan. My name is Joel Hovey, and I am the head of our enterprise sales here at Consensus, and I'm going to be moderating your session. So you probably know this already, but DemoFest is presented by Consensus, who is leading the world in the new era of demo automation. Our platform helps get your buyers what they need when they need it, rather than making them wait. And it then multiplies your revenue team's impact with unique insights on those buyers. And as a result, you've probably seen this if you're joining today's session, because today's customer day, but faster close times, larger deals, higher close rates. And you can learn more at Go Consensus. If you do have more questions, feel free to check out the automated demo in the session, inside of your events tab, or you can go to our website and check it out there as well. These sessions are all live, and we do our very best to make them highly interactive. So please make sure that you're using the chat function up on the top right of your screen to engage with the audience. I'm going to be monitoring the chat the entire session, and feeding any questions and comments over to Ellie as she's presenting. There's also a poll that will happen during the presentation, so please feel free to engage there on the top right of your screen. Also, Q&A at the end of our session. We're going to carve out some time to address any questions that come in, especially if we haven't made time during the session or the presentation to address those. Lastly, if you have any technical issues or difficulties, you can click the settings cog at the bottom of your screen, and then you can even access a help document should you have any questions. But the real reason you're here is not to hear me. It's to hear Ellie. So I want to introduce Ellie before we get started. Ellie is Vice President of Solutions at Canvas GFX, where she guides customers and partners as they leverage model-based work instructions within engineering workflows to drive transparency, sustainability, and quality. She has over 10 years experience in aerospace design and manufacturing, 3D visualizations, and PLM. She even holds a bachelor's and a master's in engineering and mechanical engineering from RPI. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Ellie, for the rest of the time, and we'll carve out a few minutes at the end for Q&A, as I mentioned.
Thanks, Joel.
Of course.
All right. Joel, let me know when you see my screen.
Yeah, good to go.
Awesome. So, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to connect with other pre-sales professionals. These kinds of resources have been really important for me as I build a solutions role in a startup. And connecting with other professionals has been really integral into understanding what it takes to be really successful in this role and to deliver a lot of value to my team. If you're here today, my guess is that you are or you have worked really hard at building something great at a startup, and you've experienced a lot of the challenges that I've experienced. I know hearing that from someone else solidifies some things for me, some learnings, some assumptions. So that's been really valuable. And I hope that some of these stories and some of the learnings that I've had have that same effect on you. And maybe you can commiserate and gather a little bit of inspiration on your own journey at building something great at a startup. So this is my contact info. I'll share it again at the end. One of the things I'd love to get out of this session is connecting with more people in pre-sales, just to learn things about best practices and share amongst the community. I'm really interested in partnerships. So if this is interesting to you at all on a professional level or at your company, I'd love to connect. So my story of how I got into pre-sales is not a direct one, and I think every pre-sales person I've ever talked to has shared something similar. They didn't graduate college knowing they were going to go into pre-sales. And not only that, what we call pre-sales is so different um, from company to company. I think there's over 30 names for a pre-sales role, um, which is which is crazy compared to some other professional titles that are really not disputed as much as pre-sales. So the picture shown here in the background, this is where I'm not exactly where I'm from, but I'm from southern New Hampshire. It's where I live, and this is a view from Franconia Notch in the White Mountains from Mount Haystack. And I think the ups and downs and twists and turns kind of remind me of how I got into pre-sales. So, as Joel mentioned, my background is actually in mechanical engineering with a focus on aerospace design and manufacturing. The first 10 years of my career, roughly, were spent doing mechanical design and product team leadership in that industry. That picture is me with the first parts that I ever designed that flew on in an engine. So that was a very exciting moment. I didn't intend, let's say, to leave it, but I caught this bug around 2019 after I read a book called Start with Why by Simon Sinek. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And I just got really interested in being vision led and leading a product team using agile methodologies and really driving value through understanding the deeper why. Um, and I thought I would do that in a product role, but I ended up connecting with General Assembly, which is another great resource for professional development, where I got connected with a mentor in product management. So I ended up making a transition into software product management in PLM. And what's interesting there is, as a mechanical engineer, PLM, product lifecycle management, is a software solution that you use every day. So it was a really natural transition, um, actually, to be dealing with a software product that I once used and then specializing in the 3D visualization aspect of that software product. So I got to take some of the expertise, I'll say, from my first role into my second role. And then the transition from product management to pre-sales was one that was really fortunate for me. I got connected with a founder of the previous company who was chairman of the board at the startup that I now work at. And originally there was a generic role for application engineering slash technical sales. And I said, hey, what the heck? This is so similar to the things that I've dealt with in the past, and this serves the exact audience that I once was as an engineer. This is a tool that could help, former me be more successful. So I took that leap into pre-sales. And I'll say, even the title has changed in the last, let's say, 16 months or so. Originally, it was technical sales, and then I got on, let's say, a couple dozen sales calls, and we realized the title, any title that includes sales, kind of doesn't really work that well with customers because what you want to come across as is this trusted advisor. And when you have sales in the title, it kind of blurs the lines there. So we actually changed the title to solutions, which rolled off the tongue a lot easier for the sales, the AEs that I worked with. So I have a survey question, and you can just answer in the chat, and Joel will help me. I'm curious where folks are from. Anyone near New Hampshire? Where are you located, and what kind of roles did you hold before getting into pre-sales? Um, because I find that we all kind of come from different areas and we find ourselves here in pre-sales.
Nelly, we're getting
So in
Boston. We've got some
Boston.
folks from Atlanta, Saratoga, New York. I'm in Saratoga Springs, Utah. That always confuses me when I see Saratoga, New York. Boston, UK, Bedford, New
Very cool.
Hampshire, New Delhi.
Ah, Bedford is about 30 minutes away from me. Very cool. Very cool.
Got
Yeah, and then
Prague.
I'm curious, any roles, any other engineers turned pre-sales professionals?
We've got a manufacturing engineering, electrical engineering.
Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, coming from wherever you start, it's kind of the lens you see through. So you'll always kind of see things as an engineer. Um, And I think that's, there's a lot of positives there. I think one of the values I got from being in specifically aerospace is everything has to be done with a huge amount of integrity. And taking that same kind of core value into pre-sales, I think helps you be a really good, trusted advisor for a prospect and a customer. Awesome. Well, I'll move on to the meat of things. So the key points that I'm going to cover today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the startup I work at for context. It's kind of interesting and cool. So I'll share that so everything else makes sense. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it's looked like to build a pre-sales role in a startup. And then I'll share some lessons learned, some mistakes that I made that perhaps everyone has to make in their first pre sales role or building a pre sales role. And then I'll talk about how we've cracked the code, not one time, just the first time, and how we're cracking the code now on achieving our next 10x in revenue. And then finally, I'll have some parting advice for startups that are my best lessons learned over the last year or so. So to start out, what is Canvas GFX? GFX, it's kind of shorthand for graphics, if that's not clear, but it's an interesting case. So this startup is around 30 people, headquartered in Boston, but spread all around, about 50-50 engineering and commercial. And what's interesting about it is even though it's only been Canvas GFX for about 7 years, the technology underneath it is over 30 years old. So um, the underlying technology was once a 2D graphic illustration tool that became a hybrid 2D and 3D technical graphic illustration tool, and then was brought into a SaaS solution, which is really providing interactive 3D work instructions for complex manufacturing. And just last year, we created our first integration to our product. So that was a huge milestone. But it is really interesting having a very mature technology, but somewhat, let's say, less mature business processes around it. Um, so that's been the journey. And this is just kind of for laughs here. But if I had to summarize, like, what's the painful problem? Um, if you've ever looked at technical instructions as a consumer and been left with an extra screw or put a whole thing together and realized that you missed a certain component or something's backwards, and it drives you nuts, this is kind of, part of the pain of dealing with legacy 2D work instructions. And then, not great for the end consumer or end user. And what we offer at a high level is these interactive model-based work instructions to serve the manufacturing industry. So 3D interactive animated instructions that can be mixed with rich multimedia. So it's, the new approach to work instructions for enterprises that deal with complex hardware manufacturing and are going through digital transformation. So that's the background, just so everything else I say makes sense. And then from here, I have a poll question, and that is, how large is the current company that you work at? I mentioned mine is around 30 people, plus or minus. Um, in my career, I've kind of gone in a funnel, started at a company over 100,000, then 30,000, then 700, which I thought was small, and then ended up here. So I've experienced every size organization down to 30. And some of the things that I took for granted working at larger companies was that every process is already in place. There's a person for every job, and um, on the flip side of that, being at a tiny company, you realize that that red tape and bureaucracy you used to complain about is something you almost wish existed because chances are, if you notice a problem, you're gonna have to make a process to fix it, which is fun. Um, but it is part of the game, I think, when you're at a company of such a small size, is you're doing a lot of 0 to 1 activity on new processes.
I love
So
that.
yeah,
It's almost like the grass is always greener, right? If you've got the processes
exactly.
built out, you're like, I wish I had more flexibility. Um,
Yeah,
and at
yeah.
least some of
We know
the poll results are coming in. We've got the majority of our audience is actually working for a company that is 100 employees or more,
awesome,
and then a
cool.
few in the 41 to 100 category.
So all a little bit bigger, which is great. This is a fun stage to be at, I will say. Some of the most fun I've ever had professionally, definitely working in an organization of this size. You can move so fast. Sometimes it's almost too fast, but it's a lot of fun. Um, so, what it's looked like as we've evolved this organization, it's not precise, but roughly what it's looked like over the last over the years that we've had our current offering, which is Canvas and Vision. Uh, Originally, kind of a 1 to 1 ratio between sales and customer success, which had to manage everything pre to post sale, which is a lot for one person to do. And our sales organization started to grow. And then last year, is when I came on and we split pre and post sale activities, which was great because each person could focus on one. And then this year things are constantly evolving, but we're starting to grow post sale. And what's interesting, and I can't really show it here, but we actually have sales professionals who can now kind of switch it for pre-sales who are both technically adept and able to sell. So we're flexible in that way, trying to, do the most possible with a small team. But roughly our ratio is 5 to 1. So that's what it's looked like. Um, but we are, beginning to grow. And this has been roughly what it's looked like. And the evolution, if I had to describe it, often startups, where they start in the sales motion is founder led sales. And for us, the person who most exemplifies the founder is our CEO, who's not technically the founder, but carries that kind of persona into deals. So we are, for the majority, somewhere between founder led and sales led. So some deals can go through without the involvement of, let's say, the CEO slash founder, let's say. But some deals now are more delving into the area between sales led and product led, which, as I mentioned, coming from product management, that's really exciting for me. And it's something I hope to keep pushing further right. I think when you sell into a large enterprise, the idea of being 100% product led is probably not realistic, but having some inbound activity that's more based on the actual product and the education you provide around that product is great leverage for a small team. And then the uh, prospective customers who come in are so much better educated. So that's the transition that we're going through as we grow. And then I mentioned processes. So something I've realized being at a company this small is the only way to get anywhere is really by having the courage to do things ad hoc to start. If you're not willing to kind of do it a little bit messy, a little bit unready, you'll never really evolve. So I'll use the example of what we call POVs or POCs as an example. So starting ad hoc and just kind of rolling your sleeves up up and doing it and learning is the only way to start. And then after you've gone through a process like a POV once, twice, 10 times, asking after each one, what worked, what didn't work, what should we stop, what should we change, and having real retrospectives around that ad hoc activity is really critical for making improvements in a process. And then, so that is something that I've taken on is starting off ad hoc and just kind of getting it done without a really formalized process, and then realizing through that retrospective what actually worked there, what didn't, what's the entrance criteria, because every time we enter a POV without these things established, it never it never progresses. So that is something that I've implemented to make things repeatable, is asking, you know, asking a customer or prospective customer before you start, you know, do you have this? Do you have this? Is this important to you? Is this person involved? Does this person need to be involved in the approval? So we had a set of questions that became repeatable in that POV process. And then taking it a step further, after you've repeated something like the POV, let's say half a dozen times, there usually is an opportunity to make that process more scalable using technology, which is kind of why we're all here, I suppose, right? So, utilizing, if something is truly repeatable, then we can implement systems that take kind of the the manual human process out of it. So, having things like on day 3 of a POV, you'll get this education material. Um, and here's a templatized email with everything you need to do to get started. Here's the schedule that we'll keep. So those kinds of scalable processes are something that's been really critical in uh, creating more success out of the processes that we execute. So I mentioned that we're kind of in our second 10x. So the first 10x that this company did was actually with a legacy suite of products that 30-year-old technology um, was used for. So the first 10x that this company went through was actually happening around the time I started, and that was taking a great product that customers already loved and then changing the way it's packaged and marketed. So there was a product that we used to sell that was sold as a perpetual license. So one of the simple strategies without even changing the product was to make that product a subscription, which is kind of obvious, right, in the world of SaaS, but that is one of the steps that was taken. And then having it marketed and purchasable through a cart interaction. So that sounds relatively simple when you hear it. But the next 10x that we're going after is really for a brand new platform solution that we think will offer a lot more value to our customers and solve a bigger, more immediate, modern problem. And the lessons that I've learned along the way are what I'm going to talk about next. So, I've made a lot of mistakes that I'm sure a lot of other pre-sales professionals have made maybe early in their career, but I went through all of it kind of trial by fire in the last year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those mistakes, what I learned that didn't work, and what worked better. So some of the lessons learned here, um, this is this is something we hear a lot, but something that didn't work was trying to be everything to everybody. So when I came in, we were transitioning out of this messaging of trying to solve for so many different personas. So if we think about an authoring tool that you can generate a document in, it could serve marketing, it could serve training, it could serve engineers, it could serve so many people, it could serve um, SMB, it could serve large enterprise. And yes, technically you can do all of those things, but generally that isn't a great way to start because nobody really connects with the messaging and you're trying to solve like so many different problems for so many people, especially with a small team. Usually, when you're trying to expand uh, revenue or business, you have an option to go deep or go wide. And I think for a startup, 9 times out of 10, the answer is to go deep on a specific problem. So, what really worked better was changing the messaging to solving a specific problem for a specific group. So, solving not just an authoring tool to create documents for anyone, but an authoring tool to create model based work instructions for manufacturers of complex hardware, um, and trying to serve large enterprise because they're going to all have similar set of problems, or more similar than the alternative anyway. So that solution has made our conversations much easier, much more repeatable, and resonate a lot better with our target audience. So this, I hope, is funny to people. It's funny to me. So this is how I feel when I'm asked to do a just a canned demo with no introduction. I feel like I'm doing like entertainment, answering questions that weren't asked for an audience that doesn't want to be there. Um, so I think this is what I kind of walked into, was this expectation that every interested person should get a demo, and just trying to get this product in front of as many people as possible. And I can't even recall a single time that that kind of sequence of events led to a deal moving. So even when I'm asked to just do a demo, I've kind of changed my approach. And this is, I think every demo needs discovery. And I'm sure this is echoed by a lot of folks in pre sales. Even if the agenda says, you know, demo, and that's your first conversation, intersecting there and insisting on some discovery before you open a demo. And ideally, qualifying the prospective customer on a problem they need to solve. If it's just a problem that's nice to solve, chances are, it's just a kicking the tires kind of activity. So what I prefer is, if possible, have that need to solve problem defined before jumping into a demo. And if not, before you jump into a demo, ask the deeper question of why they're looking at your solution. What do things look like today? How would you like them to look? Um, would this make a difference for you? So the next thing that I learned was, um, or the approach that I used at first, was trying to demo every single feature in the product because there's so many to show, and thinking, oh, if I demo all of the features, maybe they'll be impressed with, the 20th feature that I show. And what it feels like is almost like a feature dump. Like, here's a whole list of features, here's everything we can do. Ta-da! And unfortunately, that is usually not effective. And what it reminds me of, if you see the picture on the right, is this story. When I was in high school in Pennsylvania, I had a music teacher, and he we had our first Wegmans came in. If anyone's familiar with Wegmans, and I think it was like 2006 maybe. And our music teacher came in and said he went to the new Wegmans, but he went in for to buy mustard, and he went to the mustard aisle, and there was over 300 kinds of mustards, and he was so overwhelmed by the number of choices that he left with nothing. And I think if we infiltrate people with so many features, instead of being impressed, they tend to be overwhelmed. So that is an approach that I started steering away from a lot, and it actually makes the job much easier, because what you're able to do is ask questions about what problems this prospective customer is interested in solving, empathizing with those problems, and then explaining specifically the feature set that can solve those problems. So it does require a little bit of agility to know your product well enough to be able to steer the conversation around that solutioning. But that is what we're all great at, is solutioning. So kind of consider it like live action, live action product management, being able to really solve the customer's problem in the moment. um, and it just cuts down the amount of demoing you have to do because you get straight to the point. And then something else that didn't really work well was trying to show off our coolest features. And like, if we think about selling wood and we just describe all the great things about wood, like, nobody is going to buy it without it solving a real specific problem for them. And if we think about model-based work instructions and 3D visualization, that's an inherently very cool tool because 3D interactive, all of that is it's very cool to demo. It looks cool, but what problem does it solve? So that's a dangerous thing is just saying we have 3D interactive work instructions, because that leaves the customer, or the leaves the customer with this question, so what? So why do I need those? It's cool, it's modern, but usually that's not enough to move a conversation along. So instead of just demoing cool features, I think using those cool features to create a shared vision of a future state is really important. So starting with the end in mind. So if we think about 3D model based work instructions, what problem does that solve for you? Do you have employees that are going and snapping screenshots constantly, in another tool and then using another tool to dump them in? And then they need to do it again every time you go through design iteration. And then, selling, saying, hey, you could just press a button and have your 3D models just automatically update all your work instructions. Now that cool feature becomes an actual solution to a problem for somebody in the organization. Um, so those are the kinds of things that we had to transition our language to, was not just showing something cool, but really focusing on, why should this be important for you? And what problems do you have today that this will solve? And what does the positive future state look like after you've adopted our solution? So if I had to sum up all of this learning into some principles on how we're going after this 10x expansion that journey that we're on, I have a few kind of principles that I've come up with. So the 10x approach, that I have in my mind, is a lot of it is inspired by a book that maybe folks have read. It's called 10x is easier than 2x, and it's really aimed at entrepreneurs, but I think when you think of your role in a startup, there's a term called intrapreneur, which really feels accurate for what it's like to help build a startup and a successful product. And these kind of entrepreneurship tactics come into play as you get creative and try to figure out what it's going to take to grow and be successful. So the three main things that I have come up with is really these three P's. So how do we do more? How do we achieve more by doing less? Because it's unlikely that we're going to grow 10x in size tomorrow. So with a team of this size, or a few more, we're going to need to find ways to find levers and the ability to focus on the biggest needle movers in order to achieve that 10x value for our prospective clients. So the three P's that uh, I came up with are becoming more product led, leveraging partnerships, and solving bigger and more specific problems. So um, the theme of product led. So some of these tactics uh, are really allowing the product to be a tool to sell itself. So doing more scalable product education. When you start, a lot of it needs to be one to one or one to few, but finding ways where you can scale, broadcast, and make education really readily available for interested customers. And then something that's really surprised me over the past year is a lot of people wanting to, given the option, wanting to do a trial where they just check in with questions. Something that I've heard is that 80% of the sales decision is made online today. So there's been a lot more behavior where I've seen people, really well educated buyers, wanting to just try something out and have a check in with questions. Where some, let's say, other more, um, you know, other customers want to do the hands-on proof of value where you have lots of meetings and do it all hands-on. And then another thing, which is maybe a boring topic, but having really, really great documentation is key in becoming more product led. So that's something, at a startup, generally you don't get to just wear one hat. So it's even something that if I see a gap, it's something that I'm going to participate in because, and pre sales, we're experts in so many things and we can kind of switch it for so many departments. We can get involved in marketing, we can get involved in documentation, we can get involved in partnerships, we can get involved in products. So I think um, when you see a gap that you can really help with, I think it's important to be willing to jump in to move the needle. And then finally, webinars, very meta. So we didn't really do webinars much until I started. And that approach has been another way that we can put our product out in a way where people can elect to be involved and then create more inbound interest and really let our product kind of stand for itself. And then the next strategy, and this is one of my favorites, is partnerships. So, as I mentioned, pre sales professionals have so many skills, they could really sit in so many seats. And one seat that I've kind of helped with is really developing partnerships, being someone who can be market facing and also technical. So this has been a huge one for us and allowed us to focus on our zone of genius and look at the whole customer or user journey from end to end. What kind of data, what kind of software do they need to interact with to get end-to-end value out of our solution? Where does the data come from? Where does it go when it's consumed? And this has allowed us to build partnerships in logical places. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, like a PLM as a source data. And then on the other side, looking at where do manufacturers consume that data? And the other thing is really oftentimes, if you're really focused on a solution, let's say visual authoring, there's a lot of tools that have that exact gap. So being able to look for those and form those partnerships and relationships can be a huge needle mover and a huge lever for a small company to add value and find new customers and new potential customers. And then the last one is problems. So at the beginning of the year at our sales kickoff, this was a kind of icebreaker that I posed to my team. And it's, what problem do we really solve? If you were a plumber, just as an example, and you needed to make $10 million, how would you do it using this format? What problem would you solve for who? And why would they care? Why is their current approach unacceptable? And if I recall correctly, the answer we came up with for this $10 million plumbing problem was that we would weld pipes for nuclear power plants so they could minimize downtime. So we think thinking about, you know, my prospective buyer, what's unacceptable about their current approach? How can we solve that in a way that they will care? Um, I've heard someone say, like, what's the so what? You do this, but so what? What problem does that really solve? So always remembering that in the language and the direction of the product, I think is really important. Instead of just doing what's cool, doing what really matters to the problem you're trying to solve. So finally, I have some tips, and this is really geared towards first solution hires like myself. So I think innovate, innovate. So I think I've heard that pre-sales is like the tip of the spear because we are the first ones to hear customer feedback about new features, to hear objections. We really have that. We see things first. We're at the front of the ship. So really using um, that feedback to become the voice of the customer in an organization and feed that back to develop a product that's more and more valuable to your prospective customer. What we've done is really create a trifecta between pre-sale, post-sale, and product. So we constantly have feedback coming from the front lines and existing users. So we're constantly iterating in the direction that matters to these customers. And it is difficult because you always have to weigh, is this, does this benefit everyone or does this just benefit this person? And that is a problem for product to figure out. Um, but finally, on innovation, I think owning your metrics. If you don't measure something, it's hard to improve it and it's hard to understand if you're successful. So, something that I found helpful is measuring the activities that move the needle, like proof of values. Something that surprised me a lot in networking with other pre sales professionals is how important that proof of value process can be, how conversion rates go to one deals goes way up when you do that proof of value. So one of the things that I measure is the time spent, the time it takes to complete, and the success rate of any POV. So I understand um, why things didn't work and what worked well. So we can constantly iterate and take things from ad hoc to repeatable to scalable. And then generally for startups, I think resilience, if I had to say anything, resilience is one of the most important characteristics to have in a startup. Um, Knowing that being in pre-sales or being in a startup in general, we have like the highs are high and the lows are low. So every deal is an opportunity to win or learn, and that learning is so valuable. So taking every loss as a learning opportunity and not taking it personally. I think separating your great qualities as a professional from the highs and lows as a startup is a critical compartmentalization you need to do every day. Don't take anything too personally. Um, and then finally, setting boundaries because it's a marathon, not a sprint. And there is an infinite amount of work to do at a startup, lots of good work to do. So, the approach that I generally use is I think it's called the Eisenhower matrix, splitting all the to dos into four and saying, I'm only going to attack things that are urgent and important. And I'm going to choose three and I'm going to focus on those three until they're done and leaving time for the important. Because if you only do the urgent, then you never really get to the strategic items that will really make your life easier and improve your company and your product and your processes in the long term. So, to summarize what I've gone over today, the first thing I talked about was what Canvas GFX is, and if you're joining late or you haven't picked that up, it's a startup that focuses on model-based work instructions for manufacturers of complex hardware. And the next thing I talked about was what it's been like to build pre-sales at a startup, and really how that's been taking processes through ad hoc to repeatable to scalable. And some of the lessons learned and mistakes that I made along the way, moving from demoing every single feature to a really broad audience, trying to be everything to everybody, to demoing really specific features around a shared vision to a really narrow audience. And then talked about the three P's of our big 10X strategy, and that's been being product led, leveraging partnerships, and solving bigger and more specific problems. And then I just wrapped it up with advice, and those are really around the values of innovation and resilience as a pre sales professional and building a startup. So, as I wrap up here, what's next for Canvas GFX? What's next for me building pre sales here? It's really maturing our operations and processes. I think I'm saying it again and again, but trying to create scalable processes by having the courage to go through the ad hoc experiments, making those repeatable, and then finding solutions to make those processes scalable. And then something that's a North Star for me is using my role in solutions to help build the product led growth initiative. I think solutions really has a role to play here because we create the narrative. We really know how to make our solutions sing and tell a story. So using uh, that kind of expertise to generate more of an inbound motion. So we have educated prospective customers who understand our solution well before we get on a call, to create a win-win for everybody. And then finally, exploring technologies and best practices, which is one of the reasons I love getting involved in things like this, to connect with other pre sales professionals and do community networking, especially at a small company. If you don't reach out, it's hard to know what those best practices are because you don't have a lot to compare to. So, this kind of community is really helpful and has been really helpful for me as I go through this journey. So, with that, I want to thank you for having me, and I can take any questions in the chat. And that's my LinkedIn if you want to scan it. I'd love to connect with anyone.
Awesome. Ellie, thank you for sharing everything. Such good nuggets and insight. And we do have a fair amount of questions in the Q&A session or section. So
Cool.
folks that are listening, please feel free to upvote any questions. I'll start with maybe the one that has the most upvotes or thumbs up so far. So Mark Green asks, have you codified your zone of genius into a playbook,
Uh,
or how do you train people to learn the right things?
yeah, yeah. I think on one side, yes, we created a playbook for our sales team. So we have a shared understanding of what it is we're doing. And that changes fairly quickly because you're learning and incorporating things constantly. So we do have a playbook. And then, very basic, but we have a shared, a deck that everyone uses. So we understand the messaging and we train on it. And we have also really open communication. So anyone feels fine coming up, to me or to anyone else and say, hey, can we do this or should we do this? And that's one of those soft things that's hard to implement. It's the culture of an organization. People feel safe asking potentially dumb questions? And I think
Yeah.
that kind of open communication is key in being able to move quickly and close things down that don't make sense.
Yeah, I love it. I was listening to the keynote earlier from Susan Bill, and she talked about how in her career, so many of her leaders have recognized in her, she didn't call it the zone of genius, but I think it would be fair to rip and replace it. Um, but she's been pulled into different business units or functions because
Yeah,
of some of her zones of genius. So I think it's so important to have good leaders and peers that you can be real candid with and
yeah,
identify them and their strengths. So love that.
yeah.
Um, any other comments on that before we maybe take another question?
No, I'm good.
Okay, awesome. We have one that came in from Jacob. Said, in the startup world, when you're trying to scale or create scale, how do you know when something is ready to move from kind of that ad hoc category
Yeah,
to the repeatable or to the scalable
yeah.
bucket?
I think um, with the ad hoc, it's a really good question because it's difficult to answer, but um, I think it's that retrospective activity, which in the software world is very familiar to us. Maybe if we're around agile activity, retrospectives are always part of it. Um, having a handful, I'd say at least three activities where you can do your retro and see some repetition. And once you've come across the same problems a few times, then you create sort of a templatized approach. And then you
Mhm.
go through that templatized approach another handful of times and you make iterations. And once you feel confident that, okay, this is, every single person with very few exceptions or every company is coming and operating the same way, then you're ready to scale. I think it's so you want to do things scalable from the beginning, especially if you know how it should be done. And that's almost like that you wish you didn't know, like ignorance is bliss. You're like, I know this is not exactly how we would do it as we grow, but we have to do it this way now. And being willing to take that repeatable approach before going to the scalable approach, because that takes a lot of work to undo if you scale something that actually doesn't work well yet. So
Yeah.
yeah, migrating through and holding yourself back from from pressing play on something that's not really ready to scale.
Yeah, I've noticed in our org, we're not too dissimilar from you, where we've been around for 8, 9 years. So we operate much like a startup, and there's not always someone for every single job. So
Yeah,
kind of all hands on deck. And another core value that we have at Consensus is, version it yesterday. And one thing that I try to add on to that core value is iterate it tomorrow, because I've noticed that when you try and create that playbook or something repeatable, it's easy to forget about it and not iterate it. But I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen what your experience is with that, with creating kind of that repeatable version of what used to be ad hoc. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think I like those values a lot. I think it's like the way I've seen is you can't decide something is doesn't work until you've tried it a few
yeah,
times.
yeah, that's
But
it.
being very willing to keep things live, um, and yeah, constant don't treat it like it's set in stone. And I think, you know, you only can really thrive in a startup if you're comfortable with change and growth. And, you know, tomorrow might look different than yesterday because we're learning. Um, and yeah, so you have to like that, and I guess I definitely do because I think it's fun.
Yeah,
But you have to have a stomach for that kind of iteration.
yeah, awesome. Well, let's see. Kelly has a question came in saying, "Great session. What are some of the unique challenges that you have faced selling into?" Sorry, the question got cut off. Selling into large engineering organizations,
Yeah.
large enterprise
Yeah,
organizations.
so yeah, we serve engineering organizations. So something that is a little different and nuanced is in previous roles, everything was moving to the cloud. And that feels like the inevitable future, in my opinion. But something that we've had to do is actually create a diverse offering that technically is like kind of going backwards and offer a flexible deployment. So on prem solutions. Because if you're serving a large enterprise in defense, then they don't really want your cloud solution necessarily. A lot of times they want complete control over any application that they take on. So that's been really interesting. And the other interesting thing is like all the legacy data that exists. Because if you think about if you're serving an aerospace industry or, you know, this kind of hardware, these planes and engines and
Mm,
ships, like they could be around for 50 plus years. So that's another interesting angle is the need to be flexible and expect that you're going to get some, you know, legacy data. So that's something we really specialize in is that visual authoring. So we are able to offer that kind of value and say, hey, even if your data is really old or even if it's new, we can deal with all of that. So that's kind of a knowing your customer and what kind of problems they face that comes into play because you can say, hey, I can solve that problem because we know you and we know what you deal with.
yeah, I love that. Well, Katie had asked a separate question about, you'd spoke earlier about POCs, POVs. She says, "How effective have POCs been in the sales process for you?" And like, can you speak
Yeah.
more to like what's made them
Yeah.
effective versus a non-effective POC?
Yeah. Yeah. That's been a really interesting learning. So Um, I think the evolution I've seen is being really overzealous about POCing everything and then reeling it back and having a lot of qualification for that. So that POC or POV is much more successful. And then what I've learned and really in networking with other professionals is that um, you know the deal close rate is much higher if you get someone to truly go through a POC. So that is something that we've started to let's say encourage is go through the POC because we expect a higher close rates. So we're willing to dedicate those resources. But the other thing I've seen is there is a small segment of buyers that are really educated buyers who really want the trial experience. So we have to be a little bit agile and know who we're talking to and be willing to go either way.
Yeah, I in my team, we in being in sales, and we're selling to sales engineering
Yeah,
lot of the time. We hear so much that so many POCs are spun up, and sometimes the buying
yeah,
group never really even spends any time in it. Um,
yeah,
when how do you guys? I mean, how do you kick off a POC typically, and
yeah,
how much handholding does it typically require in your experience? Any lessons learned there?
yeah. 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 So it's something that I've formalized is the entrance criteria, what needs to be provided, who should be involved, and the exact schedule that we can expect to engage on from the beginning. And we almost have like like not officially an MOU, but you could consider it like an MOU process. So it feels more formal and more of a commitment. Um,
Mm,
and I think that just helps everyone understand like what's at stake, what am I trying to solve? Um, and yeah, I think on the other hand, when you spin up, just say, here's a trial and just let it go. Um, and yeah, people don't engage. So having those check-ins from the beginning, understand the problem they're trying to solve, and say, "Oh, I know that you are trying to do X with our product. Do you want to? Could I get on a phone call with you for 15 or 30 minutes to see how you're doing with that?" So keeping them accountable, because oftentimes there is a real business problem that they're trying to solve. So you almost offering that accountability is a little bit of a service, I
hmm.
think, in the process.
Yeah, love that. Well, we are about at time. We've got a few minutes remaining. We've got to do a little bit of wrap up
Yeah.
logistics. But thank you guys so much for attending. And gosh, Ellie, thank you so much for all the insight you shared with us so far. This has been an awesome session. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen the chat now that you're not sharing your screen, but so
No,
many
not
people
sharing.
have just said, great session. Um,
Yeah, thank you
so,
so much. Thanks for having me, and yeah, I look forward to more of this Demo Fest presentations.
of course. Well, as a reminder for everybody who's still here, this is our virtual demo fest that you're here present for. We also do some of these sessions and events in person, Demo Fest X, GFX. We already did one earlier this year in San Francisco. We've got two coming up in October in London. And gosh, if you are in the UK and you haven't registered for it, get there quick because we've had the day of the event lines around the building trying to just get having people show up hoping they can get in because it was already booked and filled. Same with New York. So they're awesome events, very similar to what we're doing today. And also, we would strongly encourage you all to visit the Expo Hall Center and our premier partners at Demo Fest. Remember, there is no transfer of money involved and anything Demo Fest related. On all of our partners do go above and beyond to make this event a success for all of you. And last but not least, there are some really good sessions coming up. I wish they weren't all at the same time because others, man, I want to go to each and every one of these. But again, the next session will start automatically for you and you'll stay in the same track or path. If you want to go to another session, go back to the agenda tab and you can pick and choose which session you'd like to join. So thank you again, Ellie. And thanks for everybody for joining. And we will see you again shortly.
Thanks so much.